Hi everyone! Today we are going to paint an easy portrait for beginners from start to end with oils. For my technique I prefer cotton or linen canvas, but any other surface works fine as long as it's primed with the primer for oil paint. I paint on an 8x8 inches acrylic primed linen wood panel from Trekell, and today I am working with Trekell brushes too. Have a look at the video description box for the full list of all materials and links where to purchase them. I'm starting out with a clean under drawing. There are several ways on how to accomplish that. You can create the drawing on a separate sheet of paper and then trace it onto your canvas. You can draw directly onto the canvas or trace the printed out reference photo onto the canvas, which is what I did for this study. I start out with mixing the darkest colors first that I can find in my reference photo, which are dark browns and blacks. You can find these in the nostrils, the eyelashes, irises and between the lips. I mixed them with ivory black from Rembrandt and burnt sienna from Schminke. For this painting I use safflower oil instead of Gamsol for diluting the paint and cleaning the brushes. Safflower oil is non-toxic and doesn't smell. However, it takes very long to dry. To help with the drying time and to furthermore manipulate the consistency of my paint, I used Liquin Original, which is a painting medium from Winsor & Newton. It shortens the drying time and makes your paint slicker, but it also smells horrible. However, I cannot paint without it. After having added the darkest parts of the portrait, I focus on the eye section. For the whites of the eye, I usually mix a dark gray tone tinted with yellows, blues or greens, depending on my reference photo. The most important thing in my opinion for painting eyes is to check the light and the shadow portions of an eye. Usually, the shadows are located at the edges and there the eye is darker than in the center. If you get that wrong, the eyes can look flat and lifeless. I also make sure to blur the edges of the irises into the white of the eyes to make them look even more natural. By the way, if you like to watch the full 2 hours long painting session of this Alla Prima portrait study, support me on Patreon. For only a small amount per month, you get access to over 90 painting lessons, including this 2-hour long real-time step-by-step painting lesson. This and many other lessons come with my reference photo and the sketch for you to print out. You can follow me from start to end and create your own realistic portrait while learning my techniques. If you want to learn more, I have lots of tutorials and real-time lessons available for you on my Patreon site, in which I teach you my technique in detail and step by step. In many of my videos you even get to see my mixing process in a second camera window, and you can download the reference photo too. And for only $10 you get access to another whole library of underrated but even longer real-time videos of all my recent artworks. If you have seen some of my works and you always wondered how I did them, then this pledge is the right one for you. Just visit my website and browse the tutorial section. There you will find a list of all lessons and real-time videos available. Then I continue with the skin around the eyes. But I don't only work on this area exclusively. In order to paint effectively, I find it helpful to add the color that I happen to have on my brush everywhere on the painting wherever I can find it. I do restrain this technique to specific sections though. For example, when I paint on a piece of fabric and it has blue in it, I don't add this blue on the sky, for example. But I would add it on another part of the piece of fabric that I am working on. The same goes for skin tones. Whenever I have mixed a specific skin tone, I add that skin tone wherever I can find it. The dark ochre tone that you see on the portrait right now, I added to the ears, the neck and the contour around the face. For this portrait, I decided to continue working on the nose instead of filling in everything else. Because the nose is, after the eyes, one of the most difficult parts to paint in a portrait in my opinion. When I start my painting session, naturally I have the most energy and ability to focus during the first hours. Therefore, I always try to paint the difficult things first and save the easier parts for later. For the nose tip and the section with the nostrils, I use a rounded tip brush to paint even the smallest details. Speaking of painting details, I really enjoyed working on the Trekell canvas because the paint application was better than on my usual canvas. I felt that I could add more paint in the first layer that I could do on my regular canvas. I could also blend better. I felt that Trekell brushes were optimized for their canvases, which made sense obviously. But I also noticed that I wasn't able to use my regular Tosh brushes very well with this canvas, because they were way too stiff for the surface. The golden Teclon brushes from Trekell are super soft and worked perfectly together with the canvas, which was an interesting painting experience. However, as amazing the first application of paint was, I couldn't add more paint to the canvas. Normally you can add paint on your canvas and continue adding it on top of other wet paint until you add it too much and you are only pushing it around. And with the Trekell canvas, this point was reached with placing the first brushstroke already. Therefore, I couldn't manipulate much. This wasn't a big problem though, I just concentrated more on mixing the right colors and applying them on the right places, instead of adding and correcting what I normally do. Also, since this is only the first layer of paint, even if I don't get it right all at once, I can correct anything that I don't like in the second or even third layer. Next, I worked on painting in the lips. Lip colors are sometimes hard to mix. In this case, the lips look as if they have a peachy red tone, but after closer inspection, you can see that they are mostly gray with only a couple spots of dark reds. In order to paint them realistically, it's important to also mimic this look and don't paint the lips red because we think they are red. Then I continued on filling in the remaining parts of the portrait. Here I switched back to the flat Trekell brush because with that I can cover large areas quickly, while also blending the colors when tilting the brush and using it from different angles. The area around the mouth is especially delicate in my opinion, because in order to paint a convincing mouth, the edges need to blur. The problem is, around the mouth there are countless little shadows, beginning with the one under the nose tip, the shades in the corners of the mouth and directly beneath it on the chin. This situation makes it especially difficult to blend the edges, because you can easily smudge all the shadows that you've diligently painted before. Therefore, blurring the edges of the lips takes a lot of focus and constant correcting from the outside of the mouth. Whenever I accidentally destroy an area, I correct it with the matching skin tone from the other side and start over with blurring in the edges. After that part is done, I filled in the cheeks, the eyelids and the forehead while switching between the small rounded tip brush and the flat brush. When you observe a face, you can make out different dynamic lines and shapes, beside the obvious features like nose, eyes and lips. The most pronounced ones for me are the cheeks and the lines around the eye sockets, but also the borders of the face. I reduce those shapes mentally to diagonal lines and use the flat brush to follow them when I paint. This way it's easier to paint a symmetrical face and to create bold brush strokes without being stopped or distracted by unimportant details. I added lashes and corrected some color values around the cheeks before I continued with the rest of the painting. I didn't have any special plan in mind about how my study should look like, so I just scooped up a large amount of paint, diluted with a bit of safflower oil and liquid original, and tried to add some nice looking brush strokes around the face to indicate hair. I liked the strong contrast and worked against it with a light grey and white that I placed next to the hair. I decided to also add some dripping effects. For that I used safflower oil and mixed in a bit of paint. Normally I create my dripping effects with Gamsol, but because it's toxic I didn't want to use it this time. With the safflower oil I got a nasty oily fluid, but it still worked out and the dripping effects looked as good as they do with Gamsol. The only disadvantage is that it takes about 2 weeks to fully dry, so I recommend using Gamsol if you are in a hurry. Then as a final step for the first layer, I placed my painting on the floor and also added some abstract splashes all over it while covering up the face, so I wouldn't ruin it. Then I finished the first session and was pretty happy with the result. You can leave the portrait as it is if you wish, but if you like to further refine it, add a second layer of paint. In order to do that, you will have to wait for a couple of days for your study to dry. I decided to paint on the face while the dripping effects were still wet. I just had to make sure that I didn't touch them while I was working on the face. For the second layer, I started out with overpainting the eye section. I added more shadows and more color variants around the eyelids than in the first layer. Because I already had a decent underpainting, I could now focus on adding details and introducing more colors to the skin. Next, I reworked the cheek area and darkened it with more intense brown and orange tones. I gave the portrait more depth by painting a subtle transition between the shadows under the cheeks and the midtones and highlights above them. For blending, I used a worn-out brush. Ideally, I would have used a mop brush in a matching size, but I only ordered a huge harsh one that would have blended the whole face instead. Next, I reworked the lips. I corrected their shapes a bit and worked on the blurred edges while encountering the same difficulties as in the first layer. But this is just how it is. Then I only refined and smoothened out parts of the face and corrected color values here and there. With a mop brush or a worn-out brush, you can smooth out paint that is too thick and blend it into the surrounding paint. Make sure you don't go over areas with thin paint when you want to blend. You always need a decent amount of paint on your canvas in order to make smooth blendings. Otherwise, you just end up rubbing off the paint. As a final step, I added more details to the eyes, like individual lashes and highlights. Also, details like the waterline and the shadows between the waterline and the eyeballs are so tiny that I can only paint these in the second or even third layer. Speaking of a third layer, I was almost happy with my portrait as it is, but I noticed a little asymmetry in the eyes, so I decided to give it another layer. Of course, I had to wait a couple of days until the second layer was dried in order to do that. I didn't film that process, so I just show you before and after. I just added a couple of details on the eyes, like finer lashes, symmetrical highlights and a little more pronounced shadows at the lower eyelids. And now I am completely happy with my study. I decided to offer this little painting for sale, and if you like to purchase it, visit my online store at leoba.info or follow the link in the video description. If you found this video helpful, let me know in the comment section. Give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. See you in the next one. Bye!